Anthony, you're described as a scientist who studies human geography. What does that mean?
So we study how do human beings think about and perceive the environment. Really one of the deepest questions in my entire career has been trying to understand, why do human beings treat the natural world the way that they do? Because when I look at issues like climate change or biodiversity extinctions or the ozone hole back in the day, yes, these are all natural science problems, but ultimately the causes were human beings. The reason why we have climate change or biodiversity extinctions is human activities, human behavior. And so I always felt like if you wanted to try to solve these problems, the answer didn't lie in the natural sciences. It was in the social sciences and humanities. What is it about human beings that leads us to perceive the world the way that we do? What is it about us as human beings psychologically, culturally, socially, politically, that leads us to treat the world the way that we do?
Mm-hmm. And you're at Yale. Tell me about what you do at Yale. Sure. And where you do it.
So I'm a faculty member at the Environment School at Yale, and I also direct the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. We study how Americans and other people around the world respond to these issues. So what do they understand and misunderstand? How do they perceive the risks? What kinds of policies they support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are they engaged in around the environment? And ultimately, we're trying to support governments and companies and advocates and educators and so many others to more effectively engage their constituents in solving these problems.
Mm-hmm. Why did you become interested in this?
So, well, the longer story is that as an undergraduate, I studied international relations and thought I had a long career ahead of me trying to keep the world from blowing itself up. So this was back in the Cold War. So I studied Soviet and Chinese nuclear policy and all that, and I thought I had a whole career. 6 months before I graduated, the Berlin Wall came down, and my international relations degree turned into a history degree like that. So I ended up following a good friend of mine out to Aspen, Colorado, thinking I was going to just ski, make some money, travel around the world. And instead I got a job at a wonderful organization called the Aspen Global Change Institute. Mm-hmm. And I spent the next 4 years working with the world's greatest climate scientists, biodiversity scientists, and others. An incredible education, really coming to understand these global environmental challenges. And it was really that experience, plus the experience of living on the western slope of the Colorado Rockies, which is my happy place. I fell out of myself in love with this landscape. And really it was the bringing together of everything I was learning from a scientific standpoint together with this embodied physical experience of being in love with this landscape that literally fused one day. I'm sitting on a mountainside after a really tough day with Aspen down below. Very esoteric day of the role of clouds in climate models. And I just had to get out. I sat in one of my favorite places and I looked around me and I saw all these little white wildflowers all across the tundra zone. And suddenly it just, with a gestalt flash, I realized that this tundra I was surrounded by were the scraps and remnants sitting on the top of these mountains of tundra that used to cover all of the west as the ice sheets were retreating. And yet, because temperatures had warmed, they were now isolated to just the tops of these mountains. And suddenly I realized that what I'd been learning about was, say, sea level rise that was actually going to wipe entire island nations off the map. I suddenly realized that these landscapes, this beautiful, incredibly tough, and yet fragile landscape that I was in, was itself going to be literally pushed off the tops of the mountains as the world warms, and the tundra won't be able to survive there anymore. And my gaze went down to the rest of the valley, and I realized that the forests, the rivers, the animals, the birds, and everything that I loved so much about this place was also going to be impacted. And then I looked down further and I saw Aspen twinkling down below. And I suddenly realized if you could just see it, there's a plume, like a mushroom cloud of CO2 pouring out of this little mountain town. And farther down valley is Glenwood Springs with a bigger plume. And beyond that is Las Vegas with a really big plume. And then to LA and Tokyo and Beijing. all with these enormous clouds of CO2 pouring out into the sky. And that moment crystallized suddenly my abstract scientific understanding of what this issue was, with this deep love that I had for this place.
Yeah.
Okay? And that moment has continued to reverberate
Yeah.
throughout the rest of my life.
Yeah. And there's many, that was in the 70s, right?
That was actually in the 90s.
Oh, it was in the, oh, you're so
Yes,
young.
I know.
That was in the 90s.
Yes.
And there's so many more billions of people that will not have a chance to love nature the way you and I have had the opportunity. You know, when I was born in the late 1930s, there were only 2 billion people on Earth. And I spent most of my childhood outdoors in nature. And I'm so grateful that I was able to experience because saying there are 2 billion people in the world at that time, that manifested everywhere. Not just in the really crowded areas that weren't so crowded then, but everywhere. In terms of empty spaces that weren't developed, and the birds and everything, and that I have that in me like you do. And I worry that when so much of that is gone, and there's so many more people that will never have the opportunity to experience nature and its miracles, that they won't have the same visceral sense of alarm at what's happening. I think we have to try to find a way maybe of getting them to love nature again. How important is the love of nature, do you think, in raising the alarm in sufficient numbers of people to be able to make the changes that we need very fast?
So I think it's really important for all people. We see that overwhelmingly people from every walk of life say how important nature and nature experience is to their lives. And we know from so much psychological research just how healing it is. It's a place of solace, it's a place of nurturance, it's a place where people feel reconnected again to themselves and to the larger world of which they're part. So yes, the natural world continues to be an absolutely crucial part of human society. That said, we also know that people are people, and they care deeply about the people around them. And so I will say that since that moment, I've had the great honor and privilege to work with and to go to many other places around the world, including with the Nupik Eskimo communities in the Arctic, or in Greenland, or poor farmers in China and India. And that original experience for me, that eureka moment, has subsequently been layered and layered and layered with all of these human experiences of the people whose lives are already being fundamentally disrupted by the changes that they're already seeing, let alone the changes that are coming. So I don't think this is we only need to appeal to people through their love of nature. Some people, that's going to be the way that they engage with this. But many other people are going to engage this through the love for other human beings. And it turns out that this is really a human problem, as much or more so than it is a nature problem.
And so is that why that epiphany that you had led you to focus on human geography? Because it's up to us, right?
Ultimately, it's a very practical question of that it's our decision. It's our choice. How are we going to treat the Earth? Are we going to solve the issue of climate change or not? That's our choice. That's not nature's choice. That's us. So again, if we want to solve these problems, the solution lies in our heads, in our hearts, and in our hands. So that's really what I've been trying to understand ever since, is how do people respond to these issues.
Do you interact very much with fossil fuel companies and their executives?
A little bit. And I will say that by and large, many of them care passionately about the natural world. They care about their kids. But there's this inherent conflict of that they are part of an industry that has long profited from this particular activity, which we now know, and many of them have known for decades, is the major source of carbon pollution, which is heating the planet and causing all of these disastrous consequences already.
Yeah.
So you know, in the end, this comes down to a choice of, do you support an industry that, with all of our knowledge today, continues to basically pollute and gain immense profit from that process? Or do we begin to say, that's enough, we are making the transition now? It's not going to happen overnight. These companies aren't going to go bankrupt overnight. But it is about moving this world to a totally new energy system within the space of the next generation. Okay, and that's a massive change.
Yeah, it means am I right that it means leaving $11 trillion of unspent fossil fuel in the ground?
Yeah, I've seen those kinds of estimates, and that's
stranded assets.
That's right, and this is where it intersects with our economic system.
Yeah,
our economic system is built in such a way that shareholders have bought into these companies, expecting that they will exploit those fossil fuels in the ground. And yet, if we exploit those fossil fuels in the ground and burn them, and that's what we're talking about, a 19th century energy system where we're digging stuff up out of the ground and setting it on fire, and not the 21st century, which is harnessing the energy that flows around us in electrons from the sun or in the wind, among other sources. You know, if we burn through those assets, we all suffer tremendously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And climate scientists are pretty much almost 100% in agreement that there's a catastrophe looming, and it's caused by human beings.
That's right. There is no dispute within the scientific community about these core facts. Climate change is real, and it's human caused.
Yeah, so why is there so much uncertainty and confusion on the part of so many people, at least in this country?
Yeah, so that's actually a really important point, is that when we look at this in the global context, there's really only 4 countries where you see a strong climate denial movement, an organized climate denial movement. The United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Okay? Those are really the only countries where you see organized climate denial. And interestingly, several of those, well, they're all English speaking, so it makes it very easy for them to import and export ideas with each other. They also, 3 of them have been very big fossil fuel producers. Canada, the United States, and Australia. Very strong fossil fuel industries. But the others, that they've all had a strong cultural value system and ethic of rugged individualism, right? This is part of the American story, the American myth that we love to tell ourselves, is that this was a country where you could come with nothing, you could light out for the West, you could recreate your life, you could find your riches, right? I mean, that is a core part of the American identity. And that's one of the things that we celebrate about the United States, is the ability as an individual to, you know, rise above your beginnings and your circumstances to do something that nobody's ever seen before. But that comes with a cost. When it becomes exclusive, it can become pathological, where you don't realize that we're also all embedded in a society. Okay? The reason why you can succeed as an individual is because you live in a society that provides roads, hospitals, education system all around you, security. I mean, the fact is that as Americans, we also are part e pluribus unum, out of many one, right? We realize that there are things that we cannot achieve as individuals alone. We have to work together. And sometimes that means sacrifice a little through things like taxes to accomplish things that we can't do by ourselves. I would love to be able to build my own bullet train from New York to Los Angeles. I can't do that. Okay? No American can do that. But collectively, we could do that. Okay? That tension right there is one of the main things that's been driving, or at least given opportunity for fossil fuel interests to exploit, to basically say all government is bad, all regulation is bad, all taxation is bad, and thus you can't use any of those tools to actually solve one of the biggest challenges and crises that we all face together.
Yeah, yeah. As I read the papers, I'm so disturbed. The stories, for example, of small towns in Kentucky that have been so damaged because of coal and the closing of the mines, and people unwilling to even add 50 cents to their taxes that might support a librarian. It's closing in me and my family, just at a time when this collective crisis requires collective solutions. And what I'm beginning to see is that just as climate denial has been very carefully fostered with huge amounts of money and incredibly smart communications firms, the same ones employed by the tobacco industry to make us unsure about the dangers of cigarettes, that this notion of individualism and doing away with the commons, with the public sphere, with the whole notion of society even, has been quite, I think, tell me if you agree, deliberately fostered, especially starting in the end of the 70s and the 80s with Reaganism.
Yeah. So this is, and it goes farther back. I mean, at its root, from the very beginnings, in fact, before the beginnings of the American experiment, is this question of what is the proper role of government in a society of free individuals.
Yeah.
And we have been struggling with that question as Americans ever since.
Yeah.
And sometimes the pendulum seems to go more towards individualism, and sometimes it tends to go more towards collective action, depending on the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, the Great Depression was one of those moments where we realized we could not solve this problem as individuals. We just could not do it. And in fact, it was the laissez-faire economic policy of that time that drove that very situation, right?
Yeah.
But so I want to ask you, I mean, look, you've had a lifetime as an activist in many different movements. And I'm wondering well, first of all, what brought you to the climate movement? Was there a eureka moment? Was there something that said to you, this is the thing that I want to spend this chapter of my life working on? And secondly, what have you learned from all that experience in prior movements that you think is applicable and useful for helping us understand this?
Like you, I love the outdoors. All of my major epiphanies have happened in nature, often at 14,000 foot elevation. I do well in high altitude, but as a child I grew up in the hills of Santa Monica before it was all developed, when there were wildcats and bobcats and ringtail cats and all kinds of coyotes and wildlife and birds, and most of my time was outdoors exploring. And as I saw, because I lived through the end of the Depression and the beginning of, and then the end of World War II, and the freeways came in, we could sit on the hill where we lived, and I could see forever. I could see the islands. And then the freeways came in, and then I couldn't see so well because of the smog. And then there were no more empty lots that I could play in. They started to be built on, and things began to be paved over. And things that I loved began disappearing. When I read that 2.9 billion fewer birds in North America than in 1970, I feel that in my body. So I think that I've been an environmentalist for a very, very long time. Even in the 60s, I would put a sign that said, you know, when I would see a car with exhaust spewing out, I would hold the sign out the window saying, "Fix your exhaust pipes." And I've marched and I've protested, and you know, I've made the personal decisions. I drive an electric car. In fact, in the 70s, we had a windmill that generated electricity at a ranch I had in California, and photovoltaic cells. And so, you know, I've individually made all those kind of choices. But I've been getting very depressed because I knew in my body that there was a crisis looming and I wasn't doing enough, and I didn't know what to do. You know, when you're famous, there's a real responsibility to use that celebrity in the best possible way you can, and I didn't know what to do. And it was reading about Greta. Makes me emotional. The fact that she's on the spectrum gives her, as she even says, a superpower. And she said, you've got to get out of your comfort zone. you have to stop engaging as though it's business as usual. And I called up Annie Leonard, the director of Greenpeace USA, and I said, I'm moving to Washington. I want to put my body on the line. And that was about 2.5 months ago. I'm more scared now than I was when I first came, realizing that in spite of all the protests and all that the scientists know, the fossil fuel industries continue to drill and mine and frack and export. While they're telling us, oh my God, if you stop this, if you ban fracking, you're going to threaten national security. Oh, if we need it so badly, why is it all being exported then? You know? So, you are such an incredible tool. You're such a resource for helping us try to understand how to get the message out the best. How do we motivate people? Fire Drill Fridays, which is what Annie and I started 2.5 months ago, we're trying to get the people who know there's a climate change caused by human beings, but they haven't yet taken that step into activism. And these are the people that we're trying to inspire. So the information that you have with the incredible detailed studies you've done is so important for us.
Well, what has been the response? I mean, as this has happened, what has been the response?
We've tapped a vein. We didn't know in the beginning if it was going to have traction. And right from the get-go. First of all, the media, because you've talked about the importance of the media. Again, it's because of my celebrity, but the media has been all over this. And they've covered it quite well. And that has allowed people all over the country to hear about it. And people are coming from Oregon, California, Colorado, Vermont, Maine, from all over to come here for that one day to engage in civil disobedience and risk getting arrested. And when I myself am not being arrested, I'm there to receive them. It's called jail support when they come out of jail. And I can see they're different. They're different. The actress who plays my daughter in Grace and Frankie, her face, she said, Jane, I'm going to move forward in the world different because of this experience. And I know it's true. Plus it's community. It's the antidote to this individualism. And as someone who's also very interested in mental health, I know that through activism and through the community that can be formed through activism, you can overcome depression. You know, I mean, we all hold existential angst. And we hold, even unconsciously, climate despair, because whether we like it or not, we are animals and we're connected to the earth. And when we know, even if we're trying to deny it, that we're killing our life support, we hold that despair. And the only way out of it is through activism.
So for the person who's listening and is deeply concerned about climate change and has been watching Fire Drill Fridays and the other protests around the world, I mean, can you describe what is that experience like to actually put your body on the line, to engage in civil disobedience, and be willing to actually be arrested, carted away, booked, and sit in a jail cell for hours, if not overnight? What is that actually like? Can you describe what that experience is like?
It's the difference between recycling or getting rid of single-use plastic and being arrested. Your body is being handcuffed and armed officers are taking you and putting you in a detention cell for something that you know is right, that you have a constitutional right to do. It lifts you up and puts you in a different place. You're in a different place in relation to the problem. And you become filled with hope. It makes you hopeful. Because when you realize how transformative the experience is, you know that a lot of other people are going to want to do this. If you can only reach them. That when you know that you're part of the solution, I don't know, everything is possible. It's a life-altering process and transformation. My grandchildren were arrested, 17 and 20, last Friday. I could see on their faces. It was the most important thing that had ever happened to them. Yeah. I want to go back to the fossil fuel people because I've been studying. I can't sleep at night when I think about this. Exxon knew in 1977 that what they were doing was poisoning the atmosphere. And then they knew a decade later that it was happening much faster than they thought. And they knew specifically what the consequences could be. And they said, well, it's not as bad as a nuclear war or famine. Are these people whose hearts and souls have been so distorted by greed, or what? Who are these people?
I can't answer that. I wish I could. I wish I could answer that.
How do they live with themselves?
I mean, look, they certainly believe that what they are doing is right. They have convinced themselves that and to be fair, fossil fuels have given us our modern economy. It is the lifeblood of our modern economy. And so I'll just take a moment to say I think one of the first things as an activist that anyone should do is to give thanks to the men and women who put their bodies on the line to actually make the modern world possible. For instance, the coal miners who went into those mines and suffered some of the worst conditions and black lung disease and injuries and even death, as well as being one of the main bases of the labor movement. So we can honor the fact that the people who made modern life possible because of the ability to harness this new, incredible source of energy. But in the process, we came to understand that that energy came with enormously devastating, unintended consequences. And in the end, the people who we do have to hold responsible are those decision makers, those leaders of these companies who knew, the coal industry knew back in the 1960s that the use of their product was going to lead to global climate change. And in those early years, their own scientists were actually helping to lead the scientific study of global warming. They were very clear-eyed in saying we need to transition our industry. Even decades ago, they said we need to transition and be leading that transition towards a more sustainable future. But some of those CEOs decided no. They would rather continue on exploiting the current resource because it was unbelievably lucrative. I don't think you can do other than conclude that they decided to ultimately put their profit motive over the potential risk to the planet and to all the people on it. And so here we are.
Yeah, and not only did those individual executives in the fossil fuel industries make a decision that they would dismiss what the scientists told them and continue, they very deliberately began to, I can't think of another word, purchase politicians, governors in Texas, state legislators, presidents, secretaries of state. It's just astounding the degree to which, almost from the late 1800s, maybe even earlier, our political body has been run by the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, this goes all the way back to Teapot Dome and the rise of Standard Oil and so on. Yes, there's a long, long history, and frankly, it's not even just the United States. There have been studies that find that any country that has oil and fossil fuels as one of the core resources that they use to try to grow economically turns into a very corrupt system. You have a highly concentrated source of wealth that ultimately ends up benefiting a very, very few in the economic class and in the political class.
Yeah.
It has happened in country after country after country, which is why if you come back to the bigger picture of democracy, it's one of the things that's so interesting about, and side benefits, if you will, but I would say in some ways it's the core benefit of the move towards decentralized, clean and renewable energy, is that it's much more democratic. I, as a homeowner, have solar panels on my roof. I get to create my own energy source. I get to sell my electricity back to the grid, okay? That is a radical decentralization, literally, of power, of electric power in this system. And so, yes, of course, clean renewable energy is the future that we're heading to, regardless of what they are doing. They're doing everything they can to slow it. That's all they're doing, is slowing down the process, because this is now inevitable. It's already cheaper than fossil fuel-based energy sources in many parts of the world, and it's only getting cheaper. But one of the other potential benefits is this ability to democratize energy itself. And we'll see what enormous ripple effects that ultimately has when you suddenly remove the corrupting power that fossil fuels have over many different governments.
God, it's like unleashing a lotus flower. It's opening up the most beautiful possibilities for what the future can look like. And the fact that the scientists, all 100% of them, the climate scientists, say, we can do it. There is no reason to give up hope. It can be done. We have the technology. We have the money if we take the fossil fuel subsidies away and reduce other, like the Pentagon budget, which is bigger than 5 other countries combined. We have the money to do it. It's just the political will, right?
It's just the political will, and it's also recognizing this moment in human history. Many of the great leaps forward in civilization have happened with energy transitions. Okay, when human beings go from doing everything with muscle to harnessing the power of animals, it drove the agricultural revolution. Okay, it's how cities and history and writing and specialization and civilization itself was born. It was in part because we suddenly harnessed a new energy source. Okay, fire being an even earlier example of that. Then we harnessed the wind and so on. And then came the huge innovation. With each of these big quantum leaps in civilization came fossil fuels, which allowed us to do things like we could never have even dreamed of. Okay? Now we are in the 21st century, and we are in the process of developing the new energy system that will fuel the next chapter of human history. And it's going to be far more exciting and scary than anything we've seen before. Best of times and worst of times.
Yeah, exactly.
But I personally feel incredibly fortunate to be alive at this moment in human history.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. It's like we have a decade. What a great responsibility. You know, E.O. Wilson, the great biologist from Harvard, he said once, quite a long time ago, that he felt that God had granted the wrong species the gift of intelligence. That intelligence should have been granted to a vegetarian animal that had no thumbs, like whales and dolphins. But we can prove him wrong if humankind makes the right decisions. I mean, really, we have the future in our hands.
Quite literally.
Yeah. What an awesome responsibility, and what a beautiful opportunity. We can be the generation that saves the future for our children.
So you said earlier that you were personally inspired by Greta, by the youth movements that have emerged and exploded, frankly, across the world.
Yes.
But you also come from a generation of great activism and ferment and protest and social change. And I think that's really fascinating, is that you have this young Generation Z beginning to raise their voices and demand that their parents and their grandparents take action. But you also have this baby boomer generation that itself witnessed and experienced and created so much change. How can those two generations better learn from each other and work together towards the solution?
Oh, very easily. I mean, the beauty is that the young people are inviting us to join them. They didn't cause this problem. So those of us who were part of the generations that saw this problem happen have to step up to the plate. They welcome us. And I've experienced that firsthand. I mean, they speak at the Fire Drill Fridays and vice versa. But what I've noticed is really interesting. You know, when the people that are arrested at our Fire Drill Friday civil disobedience, you know, they've grown every week, and there's always more women than men. And I think that there's a reason for that, and there's a reason why very often older women are leading in the climate crisis. First of all, what have we got to lose? You know, our lives are pretty much behind us, so we can afford to be really brave. But then also, I think evolutionarily, the notion of interdependence and communalism is in our bones. We sat around the campfire gathering roots and nuts and tending to each other's children while the guys were out doing very individualistic things, you know, like throwing a spear at a lion. We developed interdependence, and so it's baked into us, I think. We feel more connected to the earth for biological reasons, human geography. And also we bear the brunt of the climate crisis, whether it's in our body fat, where we, you know, hold a lot of the toxins and pollutants longer than men do because they don't have as much body fat, to the fact that we are the kind of the keepers of the family and the community. So when extreme weather events damage the community, we're the ones that have to take care. And yet 80% of us are climate refugees. We're not the first ones to be taken care of.
You're reminding me of, there's so many new voices coming to this issue. And just to give you an example, to springboard off something you just mentioned, there's the story of, there's a conservative evangelical Republican woman who got pregnant, and she went to her doctor and said, well, I want to nurture my baby, so I should probably be eating a lot of fish, right? And he said, no, you should not eat fish. And she said, why not? Because the fish is laced with mercury. And she was like, what? The fish has mercury in it? So she started doing research and found that the biggest source of mercury in the United States is the burning of coal and coal-fired power plants. And for her, she's coming from a conservative and religious background, she realized that she was poisoning the unborn, her unborn child. Okay? Not by any choice of her own, just by breathing. That literally she was breathing in and filtering the pollutants out of the air and into her own womb. And it radicalized her. And she actually created a conservative women's group to fight for climate action. And that's an example of how this issue, which seems so politically polarizing, and it is in so many ways, certainly within Washington, D.C., and yet we all have multiple identities. Okay? And so I think one of the real challenges for the movement is how to reach out and engage people on the basis of identities that are not just, are you a Democrat or a Republican or a liberal or a conservative? How can you connect with people based on your love for a place, your position as a grandparent or as a parent or as a child, as a baseball coach? I mean, there are so many other identities available
That's
to
right.
us.
As a Catholic, given what the Pope is saying
Exactly.
in his encyclical, yeah.
That's right. And speaking of which, that encyclical, it got a lot of attention at the time, but it is an instant classic. It is one of those books that will be read for generations to come. One, because even though he's the Pope, he did not pontificate. It's readable. It's something that anyone can pick up and understand. But in that work, he does some of the deepest cultural spade digging that I've seen in a long time. So one of the longest standing challenges or debates within the Judeo-Christian tradition is how to interpret Genesis, okay? The creation of the universe. Because on the one hand, God creates the universe, it is good. He separates the heavens from the earth, it is good. Each of those steps and phases, it is good, it is good, it is good. And then comes that phrase, but thou shalt have dominion over the earth and all of its inhabitants. Okay? And so that has been taken by one side of the tradition to say we have dominion over the earth. It has been given to human beings to do whatever we wish. It is our gift. But there's another passage of Genesis which is about tilling and tending the garden. That we have been put on this earth to take care of God's creation, which, by the way, he kept telling us was good. And that is the responsibility of human beings. And that is what's the basis of what's called the stewardship ethic. And those two different interpretations of that seminal work have been debated for thousands of years within both Judaism and the various different types of Christianity. But with the Pope's encyclical, he finally tried to resolve it. He said that the correct interpretation, the interpretation for this time, is the stewardship ethic. That we are put on this earth to take care of God's creation. And that is just beginning to, it's such deep, deep level work that is just now starting to work its way through the larger culture of believers, of which, the Pope has, I think, well over 1 billion Catholics around the world.
So it's percolating.
It's beginning to
I'm
percolate.
so glad to hear that.
That's right. But that's an example of where the work doesn't just happen at the level of policy, right? Or regulation and taxes and even protest. There's also work to be done at this really, really, really deep level of defining who are we as human beings? What is our proper relationship to one another? What is our proper relationship to the world of which we're part? And for those that believe, what is our relationship to the divine, however you imagine that? Okay? That's the most profound level that ultimately defines what this relationship to the world around us and the people in it should be.
Yeah. And you see that, I think that recognizing and admitting climate change and becoming active within that perception and that movement, I think alters your relationship to each other and to the earth. And it's one reason why it can lift you out of despair
Say more about that.
and loneliness.
How have you personally felt that through even not just climate activism,
You know
but all
something?
activism?
This is a really superficial answer, but over the last months, as I have run into people who knew me a couple of years ago and haven't seen me since, they say, "You look so much younger. You look so much better. You have so much energy." And I know why. It's because I know what I'm doing. I'm doing something about it. I'm not just lying in bed worrying. I'm actually doing something about it. And that's what makes the difference. So, hope is so important. What is your main source of hope?
So my main source of hope actually comes from a radio program that we host called Climate Connections. Been doing it for over 6 years, in which we try to find and tell the first-person stories of people across the country who are either experiencing the impacts here and now. So climate change is here and now, not some distant problem. But even more importantly, the people who are, like you, rolling up their sleeves and taking action to make a difference in whatever way they can within their own sphere of influence. And I have to say, and I've been working on this issue for 30 years, I had no idea what people were doing all around us, because it's not what the news media covers. The news media always is focused on what's the biggest crisis or the biggest, if it bleeds, it leads, and so on. This is the quiet work of people in every walk of life who are doing what they can to help solve this problem, without any of them thinking that I alone can fix it. Okay, and just the incredible things that people are coming up with and doing in their own lives has been an immense source of inspiration, because what you realize is that you're not alone. You may never know the faces and the names of the millions of people around the world who are already taking action, but they are. They are. And I won't do this justice, but Robert Kennedy once said in a speech in Cape Town, with each action is sent out as a ripple of hope. And those ripples begin to gather, and they come together, and they become essentially a tidal wave of social change. I think that's exactly what's happening on this planet as we speak.
Yeah. You said that with just 3.5% of the population, one can make policy change. Am I quoting you correctly?
That's not my...
It's not yours, but you reference that.
But the general idea, I think, is exactly right. That social change doesn't happen when 90% of the people are out. I mean, you experienced this. I mean, you've been part of the civil rights movement, the indigenous rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement. Those movements and the environmental movement, they didn't succeed when 90% of people were out marching the streets. That never happened. Change is always led by a vanguard, by a small set of people who become passionately concerned about a particular issue, and they force it onto the political agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And they force elected officials and other leaders in society to take note and to take action, to hold their feet to the fire.
Yeah, exactly. So how close are we to 3.5%? Or how far away?
I think we're actually very close.
We're getting close.
So one of the groups that we have a way of describing this that we've identified global warming in 6 Americas, 6 different parts of the country that each respond to this issue in a very different way. And one of them is a group that we call the Alarmed. This is a group of people who are absolutely convinced it's happening, it's human cause, they're very worried about it, they strongly support action, and they are desperate to know what they can do. The Alarmed in our most recent survey was 75 million Americans.
What percent of our population is that?
31%. Okay? 31%. So there's this enormous group of Americans who are already very, very worried and want action, but they have not yet been enlisted in this fight.
Okay.
They have not yet actually done what they can to take action again within the sphere of their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
A few will follow your example and take direct action and civil disobedience. And there is a huge number of people, probably around 13 million, who say that they would personally engage in civil disobedience. But there's so much more that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Okay? Even the simplest act of talking to your friends and family about this issue is an enormously important thing to do.
Yeah. So one more thing, because you asked me what kind of got me, what was the trigger, and I mentioned Greta, but there was another thing that absolutely blew my mind when I read the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The scientists, well, you're one, who are usually kind of under the radar and trying to stay neutral. The scientists were saying, people, the only thing that's going to make this happen is by getting into the streets, organize, mobilize in the unprecedented numbers. That just astounded me. But it's always been what it took, right?
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah. People
because
mobilized.
This is not a fight that can be won purely through reasoned argument.
Yeah.
This has to be through an exercise in political power, because you're fighting to change a system that has been built in such a way that it benefits certain people and not most of the rest of the people.
Yeah.
And that will not change without a fight. And I wish as a scientist that I could just publish my papers, make my logical, rational argument, and that would be it. The world would say, oh, that is what we need to do. And many people in the world, by the way, have in fact read those reports and reached the conclusion that we must take action. But it has not been enough. Scientists alone are not strong enough. Environmentalists alone are not strong enough. This is now an issue that is going to require all hands on deck.
Yeah.
Okay? We need everyone's voices to speak up and say this is an issue that I care deeply about for myself as well as my kids and my grandkids.
Thank you, Tony.
Oh, thank you.